So people, yes, are exploring this idea of what is a world where the applications can be basically. We see it like this: like in the centralized web, when you say Facebook.com or Twitter.com, you think of the user interface, but what you really have is a mixture of code, data, and infrastructure behind a domain name, and it's all
Right.
siloed and sort of smushed together. And well, in Arweave, what we do is we just radically decouple those things. So you can pull back the application, which itself is now just code that is immutable, permanent, and stored without owner in the system. You can pull that back on any infrastructure you want. We call those gateways. And that means your application is radically portable. But even weirder, and this is where things get, I think, really exciting, is that the data is decoupled from the applications. So that means that if you upload a piece of data using one user interface, you can pull that data back using another interface. It's like every single application has a radically open API everywhere. And so as a developer, this is like a whole different game, because when you start like a Twitter-like application, you don't have the cold start. You don't even need to have like the network, because you've already got everyone that's got an Arweave wallet is a user of your system.
Welcome to Mission DeFi with Brad Nickel, where we explore projects in decentralized finance that are innovating and driving our mission of financial freedom forward. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review Mission DeFi and spread the word by posting a tweet to the show. All opinions expressed by Brad Nickel or his guests are their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Black Knox, Material Indicators, or any other affiliated organizations. You should not treat any opinion expressed by Brad Nickel or his guests as an inducement to make a particular investment, follow a particular strategy, or become involved with any project. A project being featured on the show is not an endorsement of that project in any way. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Now, here's Mission DeFi with Brad Nickel.
I have Sam Wiliams on the show. He's the creator of Arweave, but I'm excited to have him on, not only because I think Arweave is pretty cool, but because I have made assumptions about what Arweave is for a long time, and recently dove really deep into what's going on. Well, I shouldn't say really deep, but deep enough into what's going on over there to think that there's a lot more to Arweave than any of us in the space really understand or know. And so I'm excited to have Sam on to tell us all about it. So Sam, thank you so much for coming on. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit of your background, and then we'll climb into Arweave and what it is.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm excited to chat about, Arweave is not just storage. It's it's storage that enables a bunch of different things. And I think you're exactly right when you said, try and explore what some of those things are, because sometimes I also feel like even we, as the people that like started Arweave in the first place, we are still just scratching the surface of what it can do. So excited to get into it. I built Arweave in the first place. It's a permanent information storage protocol, essentially like Bitcoin for data. You put information inside the protocol, and it stores it in many different nodes around the world, so much so that it can't possibly be lost over time. And we have a sustainable endowment structure to back this. So kind of the DeFi-ish side of Arweave, which is basically, we pay for 200 years worth of storage upfront when you put data in, which sounds relatively expensive, but actually storage is so cheap that for like relatively small things like NFT images or something like that, it's like a cent or two. Same with web pages. Yes, so you pay for 200 years worth of storage. As the cost of storage declines, 200 years expands out. That's essentially what we realize is kind of the nugget of how you can make an economically sustainable machine to store data for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And our real goal when we got started was to build essentially humanity's collective knowledge store, something that is neutral and provably safe and can store data for such a long period of time that it can be passed between generation to generation. That's what got us started. But
what were you doing before you decided that you wanted to create this thing, right? And then kind of what was the thing that birthed the idea? Like, were you sitting one day and saying, I really need a way to store data, or what?
So I was doing a PhD in, well, ostensibly in operating system design, distributed operating system design. But in truth, like I built, the core of the operating system that I created in like the first year of my PhD, and that gave me quite a lot of time to sit and read about, you know, geopolitics was actually the thing that I was obsessed with. Frankly, I just woke up every morning, started reading that geopolitics online, and then I read until late in the night, and then I'd listen to an audiobook while walking, and then I'd go to sleep. And I did this relentlessly. And what really sort of gave birth, if you will, to Arweave was the final stage of that. So I was really fascinated with trying to understand how the system of the world works in as much detail as I could. I don't know why. I'm obsessed with that. It's so interesting to me. It's a machine, one way or another, but it's got people in it, and they're all doing different things. And it's understanding how that operates is just like obscenely interesting to me. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. What really led to Arweave was at the end of that, I started reading about the authoritarian regimes of the past. And there was something that I don't know, my life changed when I read 1984 when I was a teenager.
It's okay.
My life changed when I read 1984 when I was a teenager, and I'd always been fascinated with how those systems, I guess, systems of government and society worked, and I guess they're kind of diabolical systems. Frankly, they did awful things, and how was that able to happen? It's a key question, I suppose. And then, towards the end of this process, I read The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn and Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and Aquarians of Pyongyang, which is basically all about concentration camps of these different authoritarian regimes on left and right. And I don't know if this is reproducible, but what happened for me when I was exposed to it's about 2,000 pages in total of descriptions of the worst possible places that humans can invent. So your mindset really, really shifts. It's like I'm looking out of my window here at Manhattan, and there's a system of life here, and people complain about it and what have you, but most people we're just not exposed to how bad things can get, I suppose. So, I'm fond of this phrase by I think Adam Curtis started using it first, called "oh dearism." This observation that people particularly in the West, where life is actually relatively peaceful and prosperous. And don't get me wrong, there's problems, but as far as it goes,
relative to others.
Yeah, relative to other places, it's sort of largely true. We hear about terrible things that happen elsewhere in the world, and it just kind of washes off, right? Like it doesn't, you hear about it, and then The Simpsons starts, I think was what Adam Curtis described it as. And he's right. Well, it turns out if you read 2,000 pages of descriptions of this stuff, and you see it in, it's not just one political ideology, it's actually just the set. It's a set of ideas of total control of societies can lead to these things that are just so abominable. It's horrific. That it radically changed my mindset. And I was like, well, thank God.
Wow.
Forget all my problems. My problems are so easy, man.
Nothing.
Thank God. Yes, exactly. Thank God for the status quo in some sense. And then I started to see, I'd been watching this for a while, but then it became, well, now that is a serious threat, not just I guess that's kind of interesting pattern in life, was growing trend towards authoritarianism that I saw in the West, and the rise in, I think this is about the only fact that both sides can agree upon, the rise in extremity on both left and right. And I'm a real fan of this philosophy that says, well, no single person can solve all the problems, and actually attempting to do so, or even contemplating the idea that we could, is like the problem. It's not the problem, it's one of the problems. You're far better off just being like, okay, no, there's this one thing I can do, and it's a tiny piece of the puzzle. We'll go do that. And just like if you put all of your effort and energy into doing that one tiny thing, you might actually succeed. And then if everyone did that, you might actually solve the damn problem. So I was doing a PhD in distributed operating systems, which is just essentially a sub-discipline of distributed system design. And that was my niche. That's what I know. And I saw that, there's actually right at the beginning of the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes, like it's literally in the first few pages, he writes about how copies of the manuscript were nearly lost at several different points. And he had to commit part of it to memory over time to preserve it. And this sort of factored in this other pattern I was seeing, which is like, look, if you want to have an authoritarian or totalitarian society, one way or another, you have to gain control of information distribution, because it's through information distribution that, this is true of all people, myself included, we are essentially programmed by the information that we're exposed to and that we believe.
Sure.
It's a system of propaganda, I suppose. Noam Chomsky would describe it. And so I figured, well, look, making it so that there is, and there's a problem there, which is, well, on the internet, the way that the protocols are set up is you can speak at the behest of whoever owns the server you're interacting with, which is like the social network typically. And there's the rub, right? That's the problem. And okay, well, I thought, hey, I'm pretty sure I could build a system that can ensure people's ability to speak, not just today, but over time in cyberspace. And, I was climbing with my father one day, the mountain in Scotland, and it was raining, and this idea just came to me while my head was down, it's raining, and he's got this photo of me, and I stood there trying to type out like a message to someone that ended up being on the early team of Arweave, like writing down this idea while the rain is dripping on my phone, and the messages are this overflowing Telegram's buffer of messages. So when we got a signal range again, we could send, they were all out of order. But fortunately, I remember. And that was like 6 years ago now.
I've heard a lot of backstories in the time I've been doing this show and missions. And I'd have to say you take the cake with that one. That's pretty amazing, man.
That's been a ride.
How has it been tough keeping, not for yourself, but has it been tough keeping that front and center of the community and of what's being built at Arweave, kind of that mission that drove you to want to create this?
No, not really. The journey was tough, full stop. It was not an easy thing. But I would say that on the 4th anniversary of the mainnet, Sophie, someone from our team who's been with us for like 4 years now, she'd had a few German beers, and she was saying, Sam, I'll never forget that time you went on some podcast in 2018 and you said, well, look, guys, I'm going to build this permanent information storage system, and I have no idea if anyone's going to use it or care about it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And here we are. I was like, wow, I don't remember that. But we were like diehard on this mission. We were going to do it regardless of, frankly, however many people wanted to come along. Like my hunch was, and has always been, that people see the problem, and now there's a big community around Arweave of people that see the problem and see the potential solution, and that also that's valuable. There's an interesting thing. You speak to investors, they're always like, oh, what's the TAM? What's the TAM? I remember an early investor in Arweave was like, yeah, but do you really think academic storage is important? It's like, I don't know. Well, I have a hunch that humans have been trying to inscribe information as permanently as possible, basically since they've been able to write. And I have a hunch that if we can revolutionize that system, which archiving literally has not been changed for thousands of years. Like they always have this centralized point of failure. You put the data there, you pray that someone's going to give you donations. And that's how the system I'm doing air quotes. I'm not sure if anyone can see this. Yeah, perpetuates itself. So, and the other thing I would say about that is the thing that gives me real comfort I would be terrified if I was starting this as a Web2 company. I think I would have zero faith that the thing would stay on its mission, because either I would break it from its mission, or the people that succeeded me over time would break it from its mission. But this is so exciting about protocols, right? We can embed in the protocols the sort of, almost in our case, it's kind of quasi-political principles. Like, it does a certain set of things, and it's designed such that I can't change it. We have those principles in Arweave written down and embedded, of course, in the permaweb. and I told, like, after we wrote those things down and we agreed upon them in the community, I told the core people, don't ever let me change it from these things or anyone else. These are our immutable rules. So that gives me comfort. I really hope that one of the things that's so exciting about crypto is it might be the first time that we're able to escape the founder has exciting idea, works on it passionately, eventually leaves, new CEO comes in, things starts to get corrupted. And of course, what they've actually made is not a product, it's a machine that makes money. That's the company, right? And it's, they're pretty effective machines. They're just like optimizing for whatever it is that makes money today, but they are not effective machines at changing the world in a reliable way. Whereas I think Bitcoin and something like Arweave, that is like a serious protocolization effort, can.
What year did you start working on it?
Early 2017. And then we shipped mainnet in June 8th, because it was the anniversary of the publishing of 1984. Of course, in 2017 we started, 2018 we shipped. Yeah.
That's awesome. And in the heat of that was Bitcoin, Ethereum, other things going on. Were those primary influences on how you built Arweave, or did you kind of build this, in your own mind first?
Well, definitely. I mean, like, I've been mining Bitcoin in I can't really remember for sure which summer it was. It's like 2012 or 2013. Started mining it. Counted it when I was still in college, in the UK colleges before university. But it was like sub $1 sort of time. So it was very, very early, and that was a big influence for me. Of course, like, that was the moment where, well, when I first saw Bitcoin, I was like, this is just magic internet money. There's nothing interesting about that. Or it's kind of curious, but like fun, goofy thing. It's not, And then it was a few years later, I started to really look into it. And around that time, people were first starting to experiment with alternate consensus mechanisms. I think it's like summer of 2012 or 2013, if I'm remembering correctly. That was when I really started to understand what was going on. And I put some of those Bitcoin that I mined on my GPU in my university halls, I put it into the Ethereum ICO, because I was like, yeah, let's buy some compute credits. This looks like fun. And so I've been watching that journey, like, since more or less the beginning. But I would say that Bitcoin is a bigger influence for me than Ethereum. I think that, well, this is maybe a controversial opinion. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. My hunch is this: like, if Ethereum had scaled in 2015 or 2014, late 2014, I think, when they shipped, something like that.
Yeah.
If it had scaled from the beginning, I think we would live in an entirely different world, where the protocols would be actually decentralized. There would be no core team. You wouldn't be looking to Vitalik to tell you, what to believe. And I think that the fact that none of the smart contract systems have scaled, and that's because it's super hard. Like, they don't really have a solvable problem. So I can really empathize with that. Are we fortunately permanent storage can scale, and we are exceedingly lucky that we just happen to pick one of the problems that is actually solvable. But my wondering is, like, if Ethereum had scaled at the beginning, would we have ended up with something that was much more like Bitcoin, where it's like, look, here are the protocol rules. It just runs. No one's going to interfere with it.
Right.
We're not going to have, I love Ethereum. I think it's a very, very cool project, but it pained me last year. And I even think that, I'm not a super fan of proof of stake, but I'm at least more of a fan of proof of stake than just burning energy, I suppose.
Sure.
But, it pained me when it's like, okay, so $8 billion of GPUs, just like instantly wrecked. Like there's no use for those now. Well, I mean,
Right.
there's barely any value in them, at least.
There are some alternatives,
Yeah,
but
but really not much.
not that they're going to stay that way.
Yeah. And that could happen just basically because of the centralized leadership of the Ethereum Foundation. And as someone, you maybe picked up, I really love protocolization. I really think that the reason that this industry exists, as opposed to just, Web 2, is because we can build protocols that have immutable rules, that it's like a fair game where everyone knows the rules from the beginning. Rather than basically just having Web 2 startups, but there's kind of a protocol underneath so you can sort of fork it. But to be honest, like, that was never really the problem. Building the software is not the problem with forking, inverted commas, a Web 2 company. Like, the software is normally not that much of a moat. It's everything else. And so I must say that I understand how we got here. I just kind of wish, I wonder, what would have happened if it was Bitcoin first, then permanent storage second, then smart contract systems. I think we might have ended up in a world where, where we were much more serious about decentralization, and the protocols would be real protocols, not, as someone on the Forward research team described it to me, like Web 2 products in Web 3 clothing, something like that.
Oh, nice. Wow. That's a very interesting take, and it's very difficult to argue with any of that. I just spoke to a founder of a project 2 days ago called Quai Network, who was very much expressing the exact same thing.
Interesting.
And he's taking a very radically decentralized approach to scaling and to solving the trilemma. But it was very interesting to hear him talk about it, the problem that way, and why he was inspired to create this chain. And what drove him was a lot of what you were just expressing about Ethereum. So it's very interesting. And I'm hopeful he'll succeed, because he's taking a really radically decentralized approach to how they're building and launching it and letting it go to the world as a protocol, focused as a protocol that can never be controlled by a centralized foundation or anything else. Right. So very interesting, very much in the line of what we see with Bitcoin. Anyway, this is kind of a silly, trivial question, but it's in my head. What was the first thing that was stored on Arweave on the permaweb?
I believe it was a copy of 1984.
Of course. That's perfect. That's perfect. Okay. So, you touched on the idea that Arweave is the tenets of it, the basis of it, the ethos, the mission of it was to create a truly decentralized network that would allow for data storage that could not be interfered with, that could always be there forever, and that it would be lasting, and that it would always be available. So we've covered that kind of high overview thing, but my look at Arweave is that there is a lot more going on there.
Yes.
Everything from data storage to smart contracts to use as a database to any number of things, as well as a community that's really hardcore. It's funny because I do trade still occasionally with the tools that I have a trading company with, and I tell the story that I was in a trade and it was going south. I didn't know what was going on with it. What I always do is I go look at the website and the documentation for the project, and then I go look at the community. I go to see, what they're like. And there really seem to be some seriously hardcore true believers at Arweave, and a really committed group
Builders
that do seem to, that do seem to care about the original mission that you started with. And so I'm curious real quickly on that. What has that been like? Was that something that grew rapidly, or was that something that took time to really convince people that what you were trying to do was much more than what it appears on the surface?
Well, there were some people right at the beginning, and they're still around today, some of them, that cottoned on quickly to what the idea was. What was useful was, our website back in 2017, we were PhD students, right? So our marketing skills were atrocious. but in a surprising sense, that ended up being a useful filter, because if you could read through all of that, and you actually, back then our problem was writing too much text, it turns out. People don't want to read that much. Okay, fair enough. But at the time, it was like, no. We are just going to outline exactly the vision and the why. And like some people read it, and so there was quite a hardcore group that emerged right at the beginning. But it did take time for people to learn, and I think part of it's exactly what you laid out at the beginning. People think it's just storage. For a start, like they think, okay, it's storage. It's like, no, it's not storage. It's permanent storage, right? Permanent storage is this thing you can't buy anywhere else. It's not like, people are always like, oh yeah, how much does it cost relative to Amazon? I'm like, dude, I don't care. Like, that's completely irrelevant. It's like, try getting Amazon to sell you permanent storage. They're going to change the offering 5 years from now or 10 years from now, maybe even 20 if you're lucky. Well, the point is the protocol. So it can offer a business model, which is, it's essentially a risk model, right? It says you pay for 200 years, cost of storage declines, it expands out however long that ends up being. It's like we've done a bunch of simulations, and it's all, the cool part is transparent. You can go and have a look. You can essentially assess it for yourself, see how it works. In our simulations, in many regular parameters, you reach way further than 10,000 years. So that is not a service that Amazon can render for you.
No.
Yeah. So I think another thing that happened is, well, we were thinking just permanent storage, store information for as long as humanly possible. And we defined in like this rather cringingly named master plan. The success for us is that the data outlasts the last human-like thing. That's when we know that we've won. Which
I like that.
Sad because I'll never see it, but that's at least the game.
But still cool to think about.
Yeah. Well, you set the bar reasonably high. Okay. So it turns out when you have permanent storage, one of the things that changes is also it's kind of power over the data. And that, it turns out, is a massive rabbit hole that we hadn't transparently anticipated at the beginning. Because when you upload data to Arweave, even as the creator, you can't remove it. And that's because Arweave is like a transparency layer. It's a ledger of speech. And we don't think that you should be able to unsay things. That's not how time works. So it shouldn't be how time works in cyberspace either. But what happens when you do that is, okay, so now you have information that's permanently publicly available with no controller at all. Interesting. What are applications? What are web apps? Fundamentally, they are data. Okay. So with this system, it turns out you can build web applications that have no controller. And that is something radically, radically different. And frankly, Arweave had been live for 6 months before we even put these things together.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And then we started playing with it.
It's amazing how that happens, though,
right.
that you build something in this business or in this world, in the tech world, and you don't, I often talk about the fact that the greatest inventions in tech come from the things that nobody thought might be possible from the original reason for the tech.
Yes.
And
right.
And that's been, I've seen that over and over again in my career.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating.
The whole of the web was like that.
That's really interesting.
The web was just supposed to be a knowledge graph, and now it's like this. It's the universal application platform. It's totally different.
Yeah. It's incredible.
Yeah. So then people started, we basically started talking to people about this idea, like, hey, you can build inside the system permanent decentralized applications that no one controls. And then the first seed of excitement around that actually came about a year after mainnet. Suddenly put out this little Gitcoin hackathon, got $100 or something for building something. And then, we had 50 applications in a few days. I was like, whoa. And then ever since then, it's been a diehard builder focused community. And so people, yes, are exploring this idea of what is a world where, the applications can be, basically, we see it like this, in the centralized web, when you say facebook.com or twitter.com, you think of, the user interface. But what you really have is a mixture of code, data, and infrastructure. behind a domain name. And it's all
Right.
siloed and sort of smushed together. And well, in Arweave, what we do is we just radically decouple those things. So you can pull back the application, which itself is now just code that is immutable, permanent, and stored without owner in the system. You can pull that back on any infrastructure you want. We call those gateways. And that means your application is radically portable. But even weirder, and this is where things get, I think, really exciting, is that the data is decoupled from the applications. So that means that if you upload a piece of data using one user interface, you can pull that data back using another interface. It's like every single application has a radically open API everywhere.
Wow.
And so
Wow.
as a developer, this is like a whole different game, because when you start like a Twitter-like application, you don't have the cold start. You don't even need to have like the network, because you've already got everyone that's got an Arweave wallet is a user of your system, and everyone's posts on every other social media like application are your seed data. And inside those pieces of data, and all of this came to us in like a very long series of surprises, I would say. Yeah. These pieces of data, well, we built the thing like a ledger, right? It's a ledger of information, and that means that we don't just store and address things by content. We think that's kind of crazy, frankly. It's not the content that you need to address things by; it's the summation of the content and the metadata, right? So you need to know somebody said it at some point in time with some set of arbitrary extra data. We call that tags, and then the data itself. That is the assertion, if you will. And so it turns out with those tags, well, if you have a permanent stream of data, a smart contract, interestingly, is really, in its core, actually just consensus about data. So it's consensus about what's the source code, right? What's the initial state? And then what are the set of interactions? That's the stuff you actually need. The compute, turns out, you don't need that in the consensus layer at all. And we had this realization about three years ago now, I guess. And we built this thing called SmartWeave, which is a lazily evaluated system, and it has these really wild properties. Like the compute doesn't need to be safe because it's running on the user's machine by default. So the user has a different trust relationship. Instead of it being, right, when you run something on Ethereum, the developer has to be writing safe code because it's going to be running on a node's server rather than a user system in the same way like a desktop app would work. And that means that the node operator has to not have to trust the developer. Well, in this system, it's way closer to a desktop application. So you can have like as much compute as you want. We don't care. It can even be like super unsafe. It can like read from your disk, and anything you want, if you like, can even potentially be non-deterministic if that's something you can wrangle in your in the smart contract you're building. So they're like radically flexible smart contracts. And when we came out with this 3 years ago, everyone thought we were like nuts. They're like lazy evaluating. This is crazy. But funnily enough, this is actually exactly where all the major smart contracting systems are going. This is like, the data availability layers that they talk about. That's essentially just a short Arweave. It's like, so what they care about is they want an availability of data for a certain period of time so that people can say, yes, this transaction came before this transaction. That's the key part. Well, Arweave does that, but it also stores the data permanently. So just one final thing on that. I promise I'll stop soon. But the weird thing is, so you start these smart contracts from the tags of a piece of data. That's really interesting because it means, now your piece of data has a smart contract inside it. Like you have one identifier, which is, you put that in the browser, it shows you the image or the video or the web page or whatever it is. You put that in a block explorer, it'll show you the state of the contract. And you query a GraphQL thing. By the way, everything on Arweave is totally indexed. So it's like a database, not like a file store. And you can get back all the tags and all the, you can say, hey, give me everything that Bob has uploaded between this date and that date. It's got app name, public square, which is our sort of open protocol like Twitter. And it will return to you all of that information, just like a database does. And so, I know, this is some of the stuff we're exploring with Arweave.
Wow. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to tell you that I'm not a developer, but I have a strong understanding of technology. I've worked with hundreds of developers in my life, and this may not make it to the show because it's totally irrelevant. But I have had for years been thinking about. I don't even know how to talk about this, but a tag-based free-form text
Oh, you're kidding.
database operating system
Oh,
that was distributed and capable of functioning. So as you're describing this to me right now, I'm like, wow, it's all there.
yeah, you should,
You know,
yeah, you should check that out. It's pretty cool.
because it sounds like
Yeah.
a lot of what I envisioned is possible through that.
Wow, interesting.
Okay. So you've got my head going, but I think we skipped one thing.
Yes.
And I think we need to rewind a little
Please.
and explain to people how Arweave functions
Yes,
and how they relate that to what they know in the blockchain
absolutely.
crypto world.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
Yeah. So we started Arweave with the structure of Bitcoin, and then we decided, well, hey, what's the minimum number of things we have to change to get from Bitcoin to a permanent data storage system? And it turns out one of those is obviously the mining mechanism. So in Arweave, instead of having, in academia, they call these scratch-off puzzles. But basically in Bitcoin, we know it as you guess a nonce, and then you see whether it satisfies a cryptographic property, basically. And you keep doing that, right. And it turns out in Bitcoin, only one person wins every 10 minutes, and we adjust the difficulty up and down based on that. Well, in the Arweave network, you do a sort of similar thing, but instead of just guessing random numbers and burning energy on it, you guess a random position in the data set, and you pull it back, and you have to make what we call a succinct proof of access, which says, yes, I can prove that here's the chunk that byte falls inside, and eventually one of those will satisfy that cryptographic puzzle. And we vary the difficulty in the same way. Fortunately, I like to keep things simple if we can. There's a fair amount more to it, but that's the broad picture. So Bitcoin replacing energy expenditure with replicating the data set. And then, of course, this endowment structure is working out how much to pay the miners, such that at today's storage prices, we get currently is 45 replicas, but with 2.6, we have a much smoother, more even replication of the data. So we think we can drop that to about 20 or 25. So it'll pay such that, and it's looking at the amount, yes, it'll pay such that it gets that correct number of replicas, and then it sort of uses a PID controller essentially to say, okay, look, I'm getting 24 replicas right now. I need to increase the emission from the endowment. Okay, now I'm getting 26. Let's decrease it a bit. And this modulates the incentive for miners to come along and add more hard drives to the system. As well as, there's a block reward and that sort of subsidizes excess replicas. Right now it's like 200 reps or something.
Okay, so you use the mechanism of what the network is for, storing data, as part of the model for how it's mined.
Yes.
And how it's and how it functions as a blockchain. But then you also have built into that the token incentive or utility to get people to add more storage so that it continues to expand using financial incentives that are pretty clear, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it just makes sense. And I read something in the documentation on your website that, and I should have refreshed it and I don't remember now, but I do remember something about how you all are calculating longer term cost of storage and how that's done. Can you kind of walk
Absolutely.
us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So there's only really one smart contract, as much as you even want to call it that, in the base layer. And that says, okay, you look at the cost of storage from miners, or other, it's a little bit different at 2.5. 2.6 is coming out in a few weeks, hopefully. And I'll just explain that one because it's easier. It looks at the cost of storage from miners. And then it says, okay, cool. So we expand out. I'm getting like this many gigabytes for an hour at this sort of emission. Fine. So what if it's not an hour? What if it were 200 years? Okay, cool. So we work that out. And then we say, well, that is the cost of storing data in Arweave. And if the cost of storage never drops again, if there's never any token volatility, and you just get straight up 200 years. But of course, generally over time, the cost of storage is declining. Technology is deflationary, which is a pretty cool thing, because it means if you have a certain amount of value today and you're able to just maintain the value. And it turns out maintaining value over time is hard, which is why we don't use a stable coin. Stable coins, they will drop to zero within 100 years because the fiat currencies behind them drop to zero. So that's not going to work. but so we have a floating token, which has volatility, but we just add huge buffers for it. Yes, we say, okay, so we keep the value. If you can keep $100 for like 10 years, the amount of data that you can store is actually way more for the same amount of money. It's quite weird. And the net effect of this is, in the Arweave case, okay, well, if the cost of storage declines at a rate above 0.5%, then you end the year with more storage purchasing power than you had at the start, which is really a strange thing, but it's true. You can like run the simulations and you can just think about it.
No, I think it makes sense though.
Yeah. And so, yeah, we chose 0.5% because it's like 3 human generations is 200 years. So for like pessimistic people, that's kind of quote permanent unquote anyway. But for more optimistic people, they can see, well, look, like, 0.5% storage cost decline per year is very, very small relative to what humans have done in the past. We're at like 30%, 30, in an average year in the last 50. And even before digital computers came along, the cost of encoding data and the sort of reliability of the medium that it was encoded onto has been dropping at an insane rate ever since basically we've been scratching onto cave walls. You see the trend is like humans, for whatever reason, we just love to encode data. We just keep getting better at it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So that's the core principle of Arweave.
What was the most difficult thing to solve for you you had this idea, you had this concept, but then there's the time it takes to actually make it functional. And was it the financial incentives? Was it the mining components? What was the most difficult thing for you all to address technologically?
No, well, until you said the word technologically, I had a clear answer.
Oh no, it's okay. Give me both.
Yeah. Okay. So technologically making it scale is important. Like as I mentioned before, and how we do that is we basically just bundle transactions together. So you deposit $5 with a bundling service, and then it mixes our data together into one transaction on the base layer. And that's hyper scalable. That's pretty cool. And then when there are even too many bundlers, the bundlers just start sending each other bundles, and they get bundled. You get these like recursive trees of bundles. And that means that you can arbitrarily scale the network. So that's pretty cool. That means we have no fee markets ever, like really ever. So that's kind of amazing. That took some effort and thinking to get that right. I would say the hardest thing, though, has been attempting to work out how to bring something like this that needs to be a provably neutral, transparent network into existence in the confusing and ever morphing world of crypto, where we all came here from a background of protocolization and decentralization, but it's like all of the incentives push towards centralization or something like that. And there is no playbook. I mean, Satoshi left the only playbook, which is like, look, you work on the thing for a year and then you disappear.
And you left.
my hunch is they were actually in the community afterwards. They just started using a different name. That was quite.
They got smart.
Yeah. But that's not open to me because I use my real name with Arweave right from.
Everybody knows who you are.
Yeah, and so. Yeah. But trying to guide this into a place of real decentralization, where it's actually a protocol, not a product pretending to be a protocol, has been, I'd say, the hardest part. There is no.
Are you a protocol? Is it a protocol today?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's been a protocol from the start, but it's Ethereum.
I mean, in terms of the decentralization that you're striving for.
I mean, honestly, I think that we are. I don't think very many people realize this yet, but Arweave is socially way out ahead of the field in terms of decentralization. Like instead of having one core team or an quote Ethereum Foundation unquote, we have 8 different organizations that all are aligned with Arweave and are dedicated to working on it. But they all have different strategies. I run only one of those, and I'm on the board of another nonprofit which does some building, but that I'm on like 1.5 out of 8 or something like that. And so So it's pretty damn good. Like, but it didn't start here. Frankly, it's been a real process to get to this point, and it's still something we're trying to work out. And it's not easy. It's not like a simple task. So, and yeah, like I said, just really trying to stay true to those principles of decentralization while also living with the practicalities of the thing. How do you, at some point there is a team that builds the thing, right? Like, how do we solve that?
Right.
It's very interesting, very, very tricky, I'd say. But we're making progress.
How difficult has it been to get over existing belief systems about storage? By that, I mean, I think there's a general skepticism of, will this peer-to-peer thing exist long enough that I'm safe to put my data here, right? I think that's kind of a knee-jerk thing.
Huh. Look, I think, so I was an investor in inverted commas. I put like $15 or something into the storage ICO. So I've been watching like decentralized storage for really since the earliest days. And I got to say, I have zero confidence that temporary decentralized storage makes any sense at all. I've seen like 4 different projects come along, get lots of hype, and no one uses them. And I think it's a simple answer.
At all?
Yeah, no one, really. They can't even pay people to use them. It's crazy. And then the reason for that is pretty obvious. It's like, okay, how many people were censored when they're storing their data privately on Amazon S3? The answer's got to be virtually zero. So, So I think the public permanent storage is something that can only exist in a decentralized protocol, and so has its own niche. I would say that frankly, we haven't experienced as much skepticism about the earliness of the protocol as I would have expected at this point. Like Meta, which is a huge enterprise at this point, they use Arweave for storage, and we're 5 years in. The good news is every year that passes, this gets easier.
What's interesting to me is how many projects in the crypto DeFi space are using Arweave, right? And right now, where my head is, and I have a couple of questions about this, but I'm kind of wondering, in terms of Arweave's capabilities, performance, scalability, what do we need other blockchains in the space?
I mean, Arweave doesn't focus on being a super fast payment chain. Like I said, that's that hyper intermingled smart contract, I guess, niche. It's really, I'd say, to be frank, people are going to hate me for this, but I think it's true. Solana is probably the best model for this so far. Which is,
people are going to hate you.
Sorry,
but definitely.
It's just, hey, I'm not tribal. I don't care about the numbers going up or down. It's just the truth. As far as I can tell as a tech person, they have done the best job of optimizing the highly intermingled smart contract problem space, where basically every contract might want to write under every other contract. But that is actually very, very, very different than something like NFTs. Because actually NFTs, I'll trade the NFT with you, you trade it with someone else. And there's like 5 interactions over, 3 or 4 year period or something. And they're not highly intertwined. And so something like SmartWeave is great for that. So I think that, like for DeFi stuff, there will be different chains for sure. And also Arweave doesn't, our block time is 2 minutes. And we don't care about improving that. It's not
right.
When you write to Arweave, you write using a bundling system, and the bundler will make it real time. But for payments, you might have to wait some period. And so Arweave is just not a payment chain. It's not what it's supposed to be for. It's hyper optimized to be arbitrarily scalable, like fit the whole of the web in a single transaction kind of scalable, with permanent data storage. And I'm sort of, led by the Unix philosophy, do one thing and do that one thing really well. That's essentially what Arweave is. It's permanent storage with a sane risk model. It's totally transparent, fully decentralized, and stable, and it's mature. Hasn't had a single major issue in production since day 6 of the network where we had 14 minutes of downtime. It's my great shame. But 14 minutes in 6 years, or 5 years now, I guess.
Bitcoin has a worst record, so I think
well,
you're fine.
yeah. We're getting close to Bitcoin like reliability.
That's great. But needless to say, it looks to me like a lot of people are, the whole idea of do one thing well is fantastic. But the one thing that you have done, it seems to me, has created opportunities for doing many things on top of that protocol layer, right? It seems like that's what's happening in the community. I mean, there are projects doing all kinds of things on this chain, and I understand that it's not necessarily a high-speed decentralized financial application, but there are a lot of things that can be done on the financial side as well.
Yeah.
That seem to be happening.
For sure. I mean, so there's what we call atomic assets, right? Where the contract is embedded with the data associated with a single ID. Well, I think that creates an entirely different form of finance, which is sort of the freeing or the financialization of the revenue flows on the web. So now every piece of content, you can just trade the future revenue flows and the royalties from. I mean, that's huge. Like, imagine that you're a YouTube creator, right? And instead of having to wait like 6 weeks for your video to get enough views so you can buy that new camera, no, you can sell like 20% of its future revenue today, and then you go buy the camera, and then you make better videos today, not in 6 weeks. It's exactly the same reason that farmers sell the futures to their corn and the whatever other crops. Sure. And the same, interestingly, as Bitcoin miners, they also sell the futures on the Bitcoin that they mine, so that you can run a more efficient business. And so I think that's going to be huge, and it's happening on Arweave now. Like, there are revenue flows that distribute to these tokens that are embedded in the content itself, and people can just trade those around. So that's pretty amazing. And I think as the creator economy gets bigger, and hopefully as it all moves to Arweave, then that will be a major financial ecosystem. But it's not quite the same as like traditional DeFi and that kind of thing. There'll probably be bridges and stuff into those other chains. And actually, Warp, in fairness, is doing so. Warp is one of the smart contracting systems on Arweave. Same with Evervision. This is another smart contracting chain on Arweave. As I said, like, this is SmartWeave is more model for building smart contracting systems than an implementation. It's like 5 different versions or something now. But they're making real serious strides in upgrading this thing to be competitive with I think, like, they're frankly way ahead of, and people are really going to hate me for this, and please remember, I still hold my Ethereum from the ICO. Okay, don't hate me, all right? But a lot better than what's available in the Ethereum ecosystem right now.
Amazing.
So, I mean, they're like eons ahead of that, but I would say Solana still has a very solid lead on just pure DeFi financial applications. I just don't think that that's going to be always niche. It's like content fi will be the niche, if that makes sense.
So how I was trying to get at earlier that I think that people unfortunately have a bias to centralized storage of their information as much as they know they are at risk for not having it or being used as the product, because their data is the product.
Right.
But I think there's a general skepticism of this concept, or not skepticism, lack of knowledge of how a system like this works, for them to say, yes. I guess my question is this: how does Arweave get to the point where the creator economy lives there and doesn't care what's going on underneath, right? And that,
Yeah, I think that's easy. It's incentives. Just offer a better product, and it'll be obvious when people realize, hey, you're telling me that there's a market for my video embedded in all my videos, and I can sell a little bit of it, and I can access the future profits, and I can go and buy a better camera, whatever it is. It's not rocket science. It's incentives, and people like financial efficiency. Financial efficiency essentially wins out over the long term. But I think that's the trivializing view of it. I think to actually get there is going to take a huge amount of time. And so that institution that I mentioned that I do still run, one of the 8, Forward Research, I see our job as being like the tip of the spear in trying to dig down into the iceberg that is Arweave, so that everyone understands, what's happening at this top like surface level, but very few people have really got to the, or no, maybe no one has got to the bottom of what it's capable of. And I see our job as like helping put in place the fundamental infrastructure to make something like Creator-Fi or Content-Fi. I don't have a good name for this yet. To make that happen.
It works.
and there's a bunch of different things that need to be built. And so we're really focused on that stuff. For example, like we're incubating this project called Permafax, and they create a system whereby they're trying to incentivize in journalism truthiness, so being true, and relevance. And they've built this very simple set of contracts that can be added to any piece of data, which creates just a basically support and oppose market, which is a bonding curve. And so you buy a token, then the token price increases, but the money just goes into the contract itself. And so someone can take out the liquidity for a swap later, kind of like almost a quasi Uniswap type deal, but there's not a two-sided market. Yes, so they create this, and these bonding curves allow you to estimate the truthiness and the relevance of a piece of content that's uploaded to the system. And
nice.
Yeah, and 5% of the, or 10%, I forget, of the commitments to the true side are transferred to the uploader. And so the idea there is, can we, nice. I won't say who, but we're chatting to, and they seem, actually I spoke to them just like an hour ago. One of the major publications in crypto, they're interested in using this system so that they can essentially create a new revenue stream where they're not paid by clicks, they're paid by truth and relevance, which is,
wow.
Yeah. So that's just like one thing we're doing, we're doing like
that's amazing. Now, does that, so let's take a major crypto publication utilizing a platform like that, right? Are they presenting the data through the standard kind of Web 2.0 domain name registration system? And then how do I, as a user, navigate?
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. We think DNS is, well, look, DNS, you're not going to kill it. I think the whole, replacing the top level domains is just not a fight even worth bothering with, really. Like, DNS is a testament to how resilient protocols can get, when they become ingrained. It's not a good protocol. It's like DNS is a straight up bad protocol.
It's
yeah. It's and the system is for like, if people understood how DNS zones are replicated around the world, there would be horror and shock. But it's what we got. And my partner, she loves DNSSEC, so she'll complain at me for this, but I digress. Anyway, look, I don't think that we replace DNS, but I do think that if we are dependent on just DNS, that's a problem. And so in the Arweave ecosystem, we have this thing called the Arweave name service, or ARNS. And basically, it's a way of registering subdomains on gateways. So you can register, I registered SAM. And that means that on any gateway that is running ARNS, I can pull back sam.arweave.dev or whatever it happens to be, gateway0.com, I think is another one. And so you have portability of access to the data, but you don't have to depend on the browsers to implement this crazy thing that, it might happen eventually, and that would be great. I'd be very happy if it did, but it's going to take like a decade to do properly.
Sure.
Yeah. We don't have a decade. So yes, you can access the data. Oh, I didn't really say this. Everything in Arweave is available in the web browser. It's purely web native. Even like Arweave nodes themselves are just web servers. Actually, they speak to each other by posting and getting, this data.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
And we figured that because we're building a permanent web, right? Well, then the nodes themselves should even speak the language of the web. And so you can access through these gateways, and you can give your content nice names, and works pretty smoothly, and it's portable. And you can then say AR://SAM, and if you have RConnect installed, it'll just redirect you to whatever your home gateway, if you will, the one you prefer is.
Ultimately, there are today steps that are required by users to kind of come explore the permaweb, right? And and they're not what they're used to. And so obviously from my perspective, the average, my wife is not conceptually going to understand it, but I would assume that there will be applications that make it so she doesn't have to understand it and see it, right? And and go through the process of installing something to make it recognize the network.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see that being like multiple forms of applications on the Arweave network. There's those that are like Web 2.5, say, right? They have like a centralized part, and then they have decentralized storage underneath. And then there's full perma-web applications. And of course, where we hope that things are going in the long run is full perma-web applications. And we see movement in that direction. But to begin with, for example, you could use Accord. So if you go to welcome.arweave.dev or ar:/welcome, if you have rconnect installed, you can go there and upload a file using this thing, and you can use even like a username and password or an email address and password, just like the normal web. So you get access to Arweave storage, but the UI and those components interacting with your user account are not the high degree of say self-sovereignty that we would expect with a proper implementation of a perma-web app. But if you were to go to dap_rdrive.arweave.net, .dev, then you can get like a fully decentralized experience. That UI lives on the perma-web. It uploads data to the perma-web. It can never be changed. They can't control it. And if they go bankrupt, which God forbid, I hope not, but if they were to, that service is going nowhere. It will always be on that. So
still always be available. That's beautiful. Okay. I had listed out questions about everything functionally, and you've answered a lot of them, but I don't want to take up too much of your time, but there's a couple of other things I wanted to get to.
Please.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we talked about smart contracts, and it now sounds like there are multiple layers of smart contracts being developed for Arweave.
Yeah.
And how are those layers implemented in the protocol itself?
They're not.
How does that function?
Yeah, so that's the kind of beauty, right? Like the base protocol is complete, and it is it's robust and mature, and it doesn't change. And the most interesting thing was to support smart contracting layers on top. It required 0 lines of code changes to the layer below. It's kind of cool. Turns out permanent storage is
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's really, really flexible as a primitive.
This is I think I really don't think people fully grasp. I don't think I fully grasp yet the power of how this functions, right? How this code and data together live here and become executable in this way. But I definitely want to dive deeper into that component of it.
Yeah, I mean, I can try and outline it as simply as I can, if you want. Yeah. Okay. So what Arweave gives you is basically like this might not actually be helpful, but the way I think of it is this.
Go for it.
It's a chrono-Merkle tree of data. Like over time.
Okay.
So it's this Merkle tree that you keep on adding data to in this stack, like one huge stack, and that's why it's scalable. Not many, many different stacks, which is another question, but one huge stack of data, and over time, you add new blocks to that stack, and it's actually interestingly a Merkle tree of blocks at the top layer as well. And you're doing a sort of proof of work puzzle when you add, or proof of replication of data in our case, puzzle when you add data to the network. And so what you're doing is just producing this huge Merkle tree that goes from left to right, if you will, in the time that data was added. Now, it turns out with smart contracting systems, what you really need is that the inputs to the smart contract need to be in an order, right? This is where finality comes from. Because look, if you and I try and interact with like an NFT airdrop contract, I'm imagining, and we're trying to claim the last NFT, right? But then one of our transactions goes through and the other one does not. So the important thing is that there is a complete ordering where mine is before yours or yours is before mine. And that those inputs to the contract are not lost, right? They need to be what we call the data is available. It's a bit of a wonky tech term, but whatever. I didn't come up with that one. I think it's super confusing.
It's all good.
Anyway, Um, I, I feel bad for the people that have to explain to people what a product is if it's data available, and it doesn't actually mean that the data is permanent or like available for a long time. It's actually just
Actually available.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like you have this whole product, and the thing is basically, look, guys, the data exists, and that's explaining why that's useful is super hard. But anyway, so good luck to those people. I do feel for them. All right, so you need to have the data be available, and it needs to be in a consistent order. And so we can lean on Arweave's consensus to give it that order, and the availability of the base layer just tags on Arweave data. You have data availability guarantees for those. And so what we can do then is we can say, okay, I want to find out the state of contract. So I say, sure, I'll run the SmartWeave client, and I'll say, is this contract ID? And it says, okay, let me go to that data entry and look at the tags, and it says, the initial state should be this. That's like, NFT, making this up as I go along, but there's like 100 to claim would be in there, right? And then there would be the contract ID. And of course, that's just a link to a piece of data on Arweave. And interestingly, the data in that transaction might be something cool, like a JPEG or a video or a web page or who knows what, right? And that's where you get these atomic assets from. So then your computer looks through this and says, okay, cool. So I've got the initial state. Let me go and ask for everything that has interacted with this contract. And there you depend on Arweave to give you consensus about the ordering, what came before what, and the availability that you're going to make sure that there's nothing that you missed in the middle, because that's another way that you could introduce non-determinism. Okay, so you download those things and you execute them. There you go. That's your smart contract. And that's like level 0, if you want, or level 1. And that's hyper flexible. Like you can do whatever you want in that smart contract because the security model is totally different. Like instead of it being that, the code is running on someone else's server, I, as the user, trust you, the developer. And so I run your code. So you can do whatever you want to my computer in the same way a desktop app can do whatever it wants to my computer.
Because I've chosen to trust you.
I've chosen to trust you, precisely. Right. All right. So then on top of that, if you want to get access to the state of a contract in what in tech we would call big O1, like constant time. It doesn't matter how many interactions the contract has had, you just get instant access to the state. Then you can use what we would call a state resolution engine. And these are just very simple systems that sit on top of the contracts, and they're watching the contract and saying, okay, is there an update? Is there an update? And you can ask them, oh, please give me the state. And they'll give you a signed attestation that says, yes, I promise that this was the state at this time. And then on top of that, you can build whatever sort of system for regulating those nodes that you want. It's really like a open framework for building smart contract systems, basically. Like the version.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And so there are all sorts of different state resolution engines. You can caching servers to make it fast and efficient.
That moment when that clicked for you all just must have been.
Yeah, I was. It was in the middle of the pandemic, and I was, and everyone was quarantining, and I didn't have a whiteboard at the time, but I did have like a what do you call it, in the kitchen, like the cupboards, just so happened to have that super shiny surface, and I was like,
oh no!
And I wrote a little bit on it, and then I was like rubbed it out, and oh yeah, there we go. You can. So I was quote whiteboarding unquote on my kitchen cupboards. And then we were like, amazing. Wait, wow, yeah, you can totally build smart contracts on Arweave, and you could have done from day one. Well, that's a surprise. It was
but those moments in inventing and in tech are so like those are levels of exhilaration that are just incredible.
You don't need to tell me. I live for that stuff.
I can just imagine. I can imagine the feeling. And that to me is really that's powerful.
Yeah.
Privacy and encryption, I'm assuming because they're files, they're stored in whatever state they are, and it's just an application that needs to access and decrypt.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we think that the base layer should do nothing about encryption. The data should just be open because it's a web, right? And so actually you want most of the data to be open. However, of course, if you want to encrypt it, then you can just store the ciphertext. And the cool thing about that is you get to choose what algorithm you want, and it's a the cipher that you use to store your data is an important choice, and so giving that to users and letting them change it over time is an important part of the architecture. actually one of our
Yeah,
three
I think that
principles.
makes sense.
It's like immutable,
Yeah.
never changing that.
That's great. That's great. If you were to tell somebody that's fairly tech savvy, but to try Arweave, what would be the 3 applications or use cases that you would have them explore? And I know that's generic
Yeah.
for different people. It might be different things they're interested in, but just in general.
I would say go to the Arweave Eco Twitter account, which used to be called Arweave Team, but now we kind of decentralized ownership of it, so that anyone from the community, if they build something cool, they can get it retweeted by that. And so it's like an aggregator.
Nice.
And look at the last 3 things that are there, or just scroll down the list until you find it.
Oh, awesome.
Because there's like every single day there's cool stuff being built. And so if I tell you something cool today, by the time you listen to this podcast, it's going to be like boring and old. So yeah, just go check it out.
I love that. I love the challenge of that. That's that takes guts. That's great. That's awesome. I think that's all kind of the core questions. When I know you said that this is obviously not something that's for financial applications necessarily, in terms of the way we see them in DeFi. It also sounds like competitively, functionally, you're in a better place than some of the chains we rely on every day for hundreds of millions of dollars of financial applications.
Oh yeah, don't get me started on that. Yes.
So while I appreciate your demurring to the power and speed of Lana or whatever else, or that this isn't our intent, I think that there's incredible amount of potential in Arweave that people don't know about.
Yeah.
And don't have a concept of what's here. What we hear in this world in blockchain is so-and-so project has decided to start using Arweave for storage, which is great.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the mission, but I'm hopeful that we can open some more eyes, because I think this is pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity to speak.
I have 2 more questions.
Let's go.
Everybody. Sorry.
I would say
Sorry.
Just that one.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the mission, and it got me thinking. I sort of see that having these, basically decentralizing the web applications that we use every day, is part of the central mission of Arweave. That is, like, funnily enough, right back at the beginning in mid 2017, I made these really terrible videos at like 3 a.m. in the morning. They're showing you how you could, in theory, build a Twitter-like system on top of Arweave, because it's like, that's how you ensure speech in cyberspace, right? Like, it's got to be a social network of some sort.
Right.
And so I sort of feel like, this moving of, yes, the data, but also the whole application space onto Arweave is like essential to that mission. Otherwise, we're going to have a world of A, brittle, but B, non-right preserving applications that everyone uses every day, where your right to speech is like, if Elon Musk, decides that you can, which, to be frank, is better than the prior situation, but it's like degrees of terrible, right?
Right. Well, here's what's interesting to me is because of the way the data is in the system and the power of the tagging in the meta, I could envision enabling everyone to have, I don't want to say their own social network, but their own view to what a social network is, right?
Yes, right.
And that
Yes.
to me is, look, every attempt to break away from Twitter or Facebook fails miserably. It's either an ideological focus or it's a split focus when people start to exodus one of the platforms because they're angry about something that somebody has done. But this idea, I think that's actually the one way that it could win. If the interface is dynamic enough and the capabilities of the data are dynamic enough that we can interconnect easily and utilize it and see it how we want to.
Yes. Funny you should mention that. Now, one of the questions people always ask about Arweave is about content moderation, right? And I'm surprised you didn't, actually. But, to be frank, I appreciate it. I answered that question so many times. But anyway.
Yeah, I just don't think it's...
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's everyone's got their... Anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, but in the answer to that question lies something really interesting you seem to have picked out, which is, hey, well, if these applications are stored on a permanent system, And you have these views into them through the gateway, like that decoupling, as I described, of the infrastructure from the app. Well, then the infrastructure can decide what it wants to index. This is super cool because it means that you can write one application, right? And you have it out there and it's got no content policy, is one way to do it. And then when you pull the application back through different infrastructure, which could potentially share your political beliefs or your potentially, unfortunately, your government mandated censorship regime, who knows what world we end up in, but then you can at least, you have the same application, you have many different views upon it, basically. And in the background, everyone's data is there and it's shared around the world and it's immutable and censorship resistant. But on the front end, if you so desire or if you are forced, you can access the application without changing a line of code in a way that is compliant with either your desires or your requirements, let's say. And so I think that's super interesting. I mean, one of the stories of Web 2 that is surprising and not many people have really the story of Web 2 as I see it, and you frankly, you saw this whole story for longer than I did, so I'm really curious to see what you think. But we basically created social networks. And then it was like, wow, look at this power of the ability to bring people together. So we used technology to decide what information should be shared rather than editorial control, which was the prior system, right? Of mass broadcast media. Okay, and then, that was a boom. People love that, it turns out.
Sure.
I love that. I'm a pro-democracy person, and I think there's nothing more democratic than the ability to let people speak and debate. So great to see. But then what happened over time is that the content moderation it's like we almost had peer-to-peer media. We had peer-to-peer asterisk media. And it turned out that asterisk was really important because that was the point of, someone had to control it. And if you can censor, someone is going to turn up at your door and say, hey, you should not be showing people that
you must do it.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, starting about 2013, there was this enormous pressure campaign that took Twitter from, quote, the free speech wing of the free speech party, as Jack said in, I think 2011, something like that, to I'm not sure your view of what was happening during the last few years, but it was the censorship was crazy. It was a long way from a neutral public square, which was what they always claim they wanted to build.
Of course.
And it's so bizarre because the real product was just this, this front end on a database of short messages. And that was perfected. But the thing that led to is this real vignette is hostile takeover and destruction of the company, firing of the board and firing of 80 to 90% of the people that worked there was content moderation. It wasn't even about
it's crazy.
Product. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy.
It's amazing.
And so what I'm excited about is that Arweave lets you, if you want as a developer, you can put a content moderation system on top. You could say, for example, this community represented by this DAO of perhaps soul-bound tokens, so it's not plutocracy, but you earn the token by contributing. They can vote on what content should be not shown in this space, and so they can be sovereign in that area of cyberspace, which is something you can never do in Web 2. But that's one way of doing it. Or you can just say there is no content moderation policy in the application, and you leave it to the protocol. And so now suddenly you've removed this massive problem which destroyed the Web 2 era basically. And if you censor too much and everyone hates you, or you censor too little and the other people hate you. We can just let developers get on with building cool products. And I think that's probably a good thing.
That's beautiful, and you can let the end user decide the content they do care to see and don't care to see.
That would be my preference.
Being able to control that yourself, and the dynamic nature of what it sounds like Arweave has, is an incredibly powerful. Back to that whole free-form text-based database thing that I was talking about earlier, is very much in line with that. That's fascinating. What is kind of next for? Is there a next for Arweave, or is it Arweave is the protocol, and the next are those 8 foundations that you talked about building atop or promoting or whatever? Is that where you are?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The protocol shouldn't change now. Okay. The whole focus is adoption of the protocol and exploring all of its. I mean, the thing that I'm excited about exploring is the wilder uses of the system and experimenting
What
with
else can
this.
be done?
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole game at this point. And in the meantime, the protocol just stabilizes and, in a good way, calcifies, becomes just, this is what it is. And anyone can come along, they can audit it, they can decide if they want to use it or trust it or not. That's up to them, but it's an open, permissionless, neutral, and immutable protocol. Yeah, and there's frankly no end of things to do on the adoption end. So that's amazing to see. Like, we just saw Meta pick up Arweave at the end of last year. There's a bunch of other people using it for just a ton of stuff. So yeah,
It's amazing.
it's exciting stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing the validation from two for utilizing a decentralized storage network.
It's very cool. Amazing. Yeah, I mean, honestly,
it's crazy.
I've been really impressed that they are willing to, because obviously Meta is trying to build a metaverse, right? What's exciting is that they're actually embracing open protocols, at least so far, to do so.
Love that.
That's very forward thinking and encouraging. I was not necessarily,
and it also makes good business sense.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
it's going to be a really exciting ride on that front. I really hope the metaverse.
If someone came to you today and said they were building something like this or similar, but what lessons or lesson that you've learned or things you've done incorrect, things you did really well and you were surprised you did, would you impart to that person?
We see so many things wrong. We try our best all the time, but we make mistakes every.
Is there one or two big ones that you were like, oh my God, don't do this?
Too many of those individual instances to count, but perhaps more usefully, I could point to a couple of sort of lessons that come from the net of those mistakes.
Good. Perfect.
This one's a strange thing to say, but I sort of feel like you should have the confidence and stupidity to some extent to just stand up and say what it is that you actually think, and to follow something that you think is truly worthy of your time and attention, and just I guess follow it to the grave, see where it goes. Because I see there's so much focus on, and so many projects do this. They really just kind of go, well, today we're doing that because that's what everyone else is doing. Today we're doing that, and the weird thing in life and in business is that you will live or die by your differences, not your similarities. So if everyone's doing something, it might be a good strategy when one person is doing it, but if everyone's doing it, it's unlikely to be a good strategy, because then you have to differentiate yourself from every single other person that's executing the same strategy. The likelihood that you're going to be the best at that is actually relatively low. Whereas if you just have an idea and it's not what everyone else is doing, it goes against the grain, and you just say, well, we're going to try it out. There's actually you might get it wrong. You got to live with the ability to embrace your mistakes and to move on. But also you might get it right, and you might be the person that's first to a sort of greenfield opportunity, and that is really powerful in life. So having the fortitude to think for yourself, I'd say, is really important, and is something that early founders sometimes don't get that information. So I try and pass it on.
That's awesome. I think that's incredibly good advice for founders. Last question I ask everyone is, who's somebody in this attempt at being a decentralized protocol world that you have an immense amount of respect for, that you think is absolutely critical?
I mean, it's like a Pareto distribution. It's like Satoshi, man. Of course it's Satoshi. Satoshi, of course. So much right. It's extraordinary. It's unbelievable. I look at, how difficult it is to try and build a properly decentralized protocol now. And there's so many policy questions, if you will, how are we going to handle this? How are we going to try and push towards decentralization, make sure it's all fair and useful to people and all the rest. But no, Satoshi just nailed it on draft one. And it's really astounding to think how did the enduring mystery of crypto that nowadays they're so used to it that we don't question it, I guess. But how is it that the largest, quote, startup, unquote, of the 2010s era came from a guy or a person or a group? My hunch is a person, because get into it another time maybe. But a person, one way or another, I think, that stepped away from it after a year, and then suddenly it grew to be like over $1 trillion in less than 10 years. It's astonishing. Unbelievable.
That's amazing.
Really, really astounding.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, it's absolutely, and I don't think we stop and think about that often enough.
Right.
But it is absolutely incredible. It actually embodies your founder message that you just.
I guess so. Yeah.
I mean, talking about doing it differently.
Yeah. That's for sure. Yeah.
Sam, this is absolutely fascinating. I am really excited about Arweave, and I'm going to definitely be taking a deeper dive personally and a project I'm working on. So
amazing.
I'm very excited to have gotten to know you, and I'd love to touch base again in 6 months or so. And, see how things are going and moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. That was a super fun conversation. Appreciate the getting past storage. Appreciate you putting the time in.
Thanks, man.
Understand.
Yeah, absolutely.